Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we will delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where silence guards secrets that time insists on hiding. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. In the hills of Ashe County, North Carolina, the winter of 1880 arrived with a particular cruelty. Snow covered the narrow trails that snaked between the pine trees, and the wind howled through the deep valleys like an ancient lament. It was an isolated region where families lived on farms far from one another, connected only by muddy paths and the occasional word of travelers. In those days, the law was a distant presence, almost an abstraction for those who lived in the mountains. The county sheriff had to ride for days to reach the most remote places, and often, when he arrived, it was too late. The Calder property sat atop a wooded hill, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable during storms. The house was a sturdy, dark wood structure, with 2 stories and an angular attic that seemed to observe the landscape like a watchful eye. Smoke rose steadily from the stone chimney, signaling life, but few ventured near the place. The nearest neighbors lived almost 5 kilometers away, and even they avoided visits without a clear reason. Thomas Calder was known in the region as a man of difficult temperament. Widowed since his 3 daughters were young, he single-handedly took on the responsibility of managing the farm and raising the girls without outside help. Merchants in the village of Jefferson, the nearest town, whispered about his gruff manner and his tendency to take matters into his own hands. He rarely came down to the village, sending one of his daughters when he needed supplies. The Calder sisters became familiar figures during those brief, quiet visits. Margaret, the eldest, had brown hair always tied back in a tight bun. Her grey eyes seemed to carry an invisible weight, and she spoke only when necessary. At 32, Margaret knew every corner of that property better than anyone. Eleanor, the middle sister, was even more reserved. Of frail build and cautious movements, she always seemed in the shadow of her older sister, silently agreeing with everything Margaret decided. The youngest, Catherine, at 26, had a penetrating gaze that unsettled anyone who crossed her path. They said she inherited her father's temperament, but there was something more in those eyes, something that no one could fully decipher. The farm produced little more than was necessary for subsistence. A few chickens scratched around in the yard, there was a modest vegetable garden in the back, and 3 dairy cows provided the basics. Thomas Calder never showed any interest in expanding the business or improving the conditions of the property. For him, isolation was preferable to company, and his daughters learned early on that the world ended at the limits of that worn wooden fence. During the coldest months, the house became even more closed off. The windows remained locked. The heavy curtains blocked any outside curiosity, and the smoke from the fireplace was the only sign that there was still movement inside. When spring finally arrived, bringing the thaw and the awakening of nature, the sisters were seen again in the village, always with the same restrained expression, always with the same haste to return home. No one knew exactly when anyone had last seen Thomas Calder. Records are imprecise, but the residents of Jefferson only began to notice his absence as summer progressed. His daughters continued to appear to buy flour, sugar, and kerosene, but when asked about their father, they gave vague answers. He was busy with house repairs, he wasn't feeling well. He preferred not to come down to the village at that time of year. Answers that explained nothing, but also didn't raise any immediate suspicions. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains fostered a peculiar kind of indifference. People were used to temporary disappearances, to families simply leaving for months without explanation. The vastness of that region allowed secrets to be buried deep, protected by ancient trees, and the complicit silence of those who preferred not to get involved. But there is always someone who observes, someone who notices the details that others ignore. And in the mountains of North Carolina, where every movement is noticed even when it seems to go unnoticed, the prolonged absence of Thomas Calder began to awaken a discreet, almost imperceptible curiosity, but as persistent as the mist that covered the valleys at dawn. The autumn of 1881 brought subtle changes to the Calder's property. Neighbors who occasionally passed by on the road noticed that the front fence had been repaired, something Thomas always postponed. The porch boards, once worn and creaking with every step, seemed to have received maintenance, small improvements that, under any other circumstances, would be seen as natural progress. But to those who knew Thomas Calder and his reluctance to invest time or money in the appearance of the property, those changes seemed strange. Margaret began shopping more frequently. Her visits to Jefferson's grocery store became weekly, whereas before it was monthly. She bought larger quantities of provisions, including items the family rarely purchased before: canned goods, basic medicines, fabrics for clothing. The grocery store owner, a man named Samuel Brennan, began mentally registering these changes without knowing exactly why. During one of those visits, in November of that year, Samuel dared to ask about Thomas. Margaret looked at him with those grey eyes that seemed to pierce through people, and answered in her usual calm voice. Father was well, he just preferred not to go out during the intense cold. His health wasn't what it used to be, and he had decided that his daughters should take care of external affairs while he focused on the property. The explanation was reasonable, even plausible for a man of Thomas's age who was already over 60, but there was something in Margaret's tone that didn't invite further questions, a firmness that turned curiosity into intrusion. Samuel nodded, packed up the groceries, and watched as she drove off with the cart, disappearing around the bend in the road that led to the mountains. The seasons continued their eternal dance. Winter gave way to spring, which yielded to summer, and then the cycle began again. Thomas Calder's absence became the new normal. The sisters kept the farm running with an efficiency that surprised the few who paid attention. The vegetable garden expanded, the chickens multiplied, and even the cows seemed healthier. It was as if the property had awakened from a deep sleep. Eleanor, who had always been the shyest, began to show more confidence. She accompanied Margaret on trips to the village, and although she still spoke little, her movements were less hesitant. Catherine remained the most enigmatic of the three, rarely coming down to Jefferson, preferring to stay on the farm taking care of the daily chores. In April 1882, a traveling salesman passed by the property offering tools and household goods. He knocked on the front door and was greeted by Margaret, who politely but hastily dismissed him. The man, accustomed to being invited in for coffee while displaying his wares, found the cold reception strange. Later, at Jefferson's Tavern, he commented to other travelers about the oddness of that house. No one had invited him in, and he was sure he had heard a sound coming from upstairs, something like heavy footsteps or furniture being dragged. The seller's comments rekindled curiosity about the Calders. Where was Thomas? Why had the daughters become so withdrawn? The property was better maintained, but shouldn't that be a cause for celebration? The questions circulated among the residents, always in hushed tones, always without concrete answers. Ashe County Sheriff William Hackett, a burly man, heard the rumors during one of his patrols in the area. He had known Thomas Calder for a long time, knew of his difficult reputation, but also knew that the man had never caused any serious trouble. Still, the persistence of the comments bothered him. They weren't direct accusations, just a collective feeling that something was amiss. In June of that year, Hackett decided to pay a visit to the farm. He rode along the steep trail, observing the dense vegetation that surrounded the property. When he arrived, he found the three sisters working in the garden. Margaret stood up when she saw him, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked to the fence to greet him. The sheriff got straight to the point. He'd come to check if everything was all right, since Thomas hadn't been seen for quite some time. Margaret remained as calm as ever. Her father was home. He just didn't feel well enough to receive visitors. He preferred to rest and let his daughters take care of the farm. Hackett asked if she could see him, just to confirm that everything was in order. Margaret hesitated for a moment. A brief but perceptible silence. Then she explained that her father was sleeping at that moment, and that waking him would be unwise given his frail state. She could convey any message the sheriff wished to leave. Hackett watched her eyes, searching for signs of deceit, but found only unwavering determination. He could have insisted. He had the authority to do so. But something in Margaret's posture, in the way Eleanor and Catherine watched from a distance, made him back down. There was no formal complaint, no obvious crime, only rumors and an uneasy feeling that he couldn't legally justify. The sheriff said goodbye, promising to return another time, and went down the hill with more questions than when he had gone up. The Calder sisters returned to work in the garden, their hands digging into the dark mountain earth, planting seeds that would sprout when the season allowed. And in the silence of that summer afternoon, only the wind rustling through the pine trees bore witness to the secrets that house held. The winter of 1882 arrived with an intensity few remembered ever seeing. Snow piled up in thick layers on the rooftops, and the roads became nearly impassable. For weeks, communication between the isolated farms and the town of Jefferson practically ceased. Each family retreated to the warmth of their hearths, hoping that spring would bring relief. On the Calder property, smoke continued to rise from the chimney, a comforting sign that life was going on. The sisters had prepared well for this period. Their stocks of firewood, preserved food, and basic supplies were enough to get through the hardest months without having to go down to the village. The isolation, which had previously seemed like a curse, now served as protection. When the snow finally began to melt in March 1883, Margaret reappeared at Jefferson's grocery store. Samuel Brennan noticed that she looked thinner, with pronounced dark circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. But her demeanor remained the same, efficient and to the point. She bought the necessary items, paid in precisely counted coins, and left without lingering in conversation. It was during that spring that a peculiar incident caught the attention of some residents. An itinerant doctor, who traveled through the mountains offering his services to remote families, tried to visit the Calder farm. He had heard that someone was ill on the property and thought to offer help. When he arrived at the door, he was greeted by Catherine, who politely but firmly declined his services. There was no one ill there, she assured him. The doctor persisted, mentioning the rumors about Thomas, but Catherine closed the door without further explanation. Dr. Jonathan Webb descended the hill, intrigued. In his experience, isolated families usually received doctors with gratitude, especially when someone was ill. The Calder sisters' refusal seemed deliberate, almost defensive. He shared his experience with Sheriff Hackett, who already harbored his own doubts about that family. Throughout the summer, the property continued to thrive remarkably. The sisters had expanded their vegetable garden considerably and began selling some produce in the village: fresh eggs, vegetables, even artisanal cheese that Eleanor had learned to make. The residents of Jefferson recognized the quality of the products, but there was always that strange feeling when dealing with the Calder sisters. They were courteous, fair in their prices, but maintained a distance that prevented any genuine connection. In August of that year, an event brought renewed attention to the farm. A forest fire broke out in the nearby mountains, fueled by the summer drought. Men from the surrounding area gathered to fight the flames before they reached inhabited properties. The Calder farm was in the potential path of the fire, and a group of neighbors went up there to warn the sisters and offer help with evacuation if necessary. When they arrived, they found Margaret already organizing the protection of the property. She had wet the perimeter of the house, removed flammable materials, and prepared buckets of water. Eleanor and Catherine worked with determination, following their older sister's instructions with military precision. The men offered help to move valuables or even to take the sisters to a safer location, but Margaret refused. They would stay and defend their home. One of the neighbors, a farmer named Robert Hayes, inquired about Thomas. If he was as ill as they said, wouldn't it be wise to take him away from danger? Margaret replied that her father was safe inside the house, in the most protected place on the property. Her voice clung to no argument. The group of men helped create fire breaks, and thankfully the wind changed direction before the flames reached the farm. But during those tense hours, some of them noticed disturbing details. The attic windows were all closed, even in the intense heat of that day. One of the windows had boards nailed to the outside, something that didn't make sense in a typical house. And there was a strange smell coming from the house, something they couldn't quite identify, but which made them uncomfortable. Robert Hayes mentioned these observations to Sheriff Hackett a few days later. The sheriff listened, mentally noting every detail, but knew he had no legal basis for more decisive action. There was no confirmed crime, only a growing collection of oddities that individually could be explained, but together formed a disturbing pattern. Weeks passed, and September brought the beginning of autumn. The leaves began to change color, painting the mountains with shades of red and gold. Life in Jefferson continued at its usual pace, but the Calder farm remained an unanswered question on the horizon. The sisters continued their routines, going down to the village when necessary, always maintaining that polite but insurmountable distance. Eleanor began attending the local church on Sundays, something she had never done before. She would sit alone in the last pew and leave immediately after the service ended. The Reverend tried to talk to her a few times, but Eleanor deflected any more personal questions with the same skill that Margaret demonstrated. It was as if the three sisters had rehearsed their answers, creating a cohesive narrative that protected whatever was happening in that house on the hilltop. And as autumn progressed, bringing longer and colder nights, Smoke continued to rise from the Calder chimney, a visible sign of life that, paradoxically, only deepened the mystery about what really went on inside those dark wooden walls. The spring of 1884 brought an unexpected transformation to the village of Jefferson. A new telegraph line was installed, connecting the small community to the larger cities of North Carolina. News that had previously taken weeks to arrive could now be received in a matter of hours. This modernization brought with it a subtle shift in the residents' mindset. The world was getting smaller, and secrets harder to keep. Margaret seemed aware of this change. Her visits to the village became even briefer, almost mechanical. She bought what she needed and left without exchanging more than half a dozen words with the merchants. Samuel Brennan, who had been observing her for years, noticed that she always avoided passing near the telegraph office, as if the very presence of that technology bothered her. It was around this time that a journalist from Charlotte arrived in the region, interested in documenting life in the mountain communities of the Appalachians. Harrison Cole was a young, ambitious man who saw in those isolated stories material for articles that could attract attention in East Coast newspapers. He stayed at Jefferson's small inn and spent weeks talking to the residents, noting their stories, their customs, their peculiarities. During one of these conversations at the local tavern, someone mentioned the Calders. Cole immediately became interested in the story of the man no one had seen in years, the three daughters who managed the property alone, and the mystery surrounding the house. For a journalist looking for interesting material, this was exactly the kind of story that could make a good article. Cole sought out Sheriff Hackett, who reluctantly shared his own doubts. There was no evidence of a crime, he emphasized, only an unusual situation that aroused curiosity. The journalist asked permission to accompany him on a visit to the farm, but Hackett refused. He wasn't going to turn a routine check into a spectacle to satisfy the press. Determined, Cole decided to go alone. One morning in May, he rented a horse and followed the trail that led to the Calder property. The climb was steep, and he understood why the place remained so isolated. When he finally reached the top, he found the farm exactly as it had been described, well kept, orderly, but with an atmosphere that made him hesitate before approaching. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she saw him. She stopped immediately, observing him with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to fear. Cole introduced himself politely, explaining that he was writing about the region and would like to speak with the family. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply put the bucket of corn down and ran towards the house. Minutes later, Margaret appeared on the balcony. Her face was pale, but her posture was firm. Cole repeated his introduction, using his friendliest and most professional tone. Margaret listened in complete silence, her arms crossed over her chest. When he finished, she was clear and direct. They had no interest in speaking to journalists. Her family valued privacy, and he was not welcome on the property. Cole tried to argue, mentioning that he was only interested in the daily lives of the mountain people, that he didn't intend to invade their privacy. Margaret descended the steps of the veranda, approaching him with a determination that made the journalist instinctively recoil. She repeated that he should leave immediately. There was no obvious hostility in her voice, but there was something more frightening than anger, an absolute coldness that left no room for negotiation. Cole mounted his horse and began to ride down the trail, but not before casting one last glance at the house. In the attic, through a small crack between the boards covering one of the windows, he was certain he had seen movement. Something or someone was up there. When he arrived back in the village, he sought out Sheriff Hackett again and told him what he had experienced. The sheriff sighed deeply. He knew the situation was becoming untenable. Rumors were multiplying. Now there was a journalist interested, and the pressure to do something was mounting. But what to do? He couldn't simply raid private property based on vague suspicions. He needed something concrete, a formal complaint, real evidence. This evidence arrived unexpectedly in June of that year. A mail carrier delivering mail in rural areas brought the sheriff a letter addressed to Thomas Calder. It was an official notification regarding overdue property taxes. The mail carrier explained that he had tried to deliver the letter personally, but Margaret had received it at the door, refusing to let him in, or call her father to sign for the receipt. She had signed on his behalf, something technically irregular. Hackett saw an opportunity there. Tax issues gave him legal justification to demand to speak directly with Thomas. He could finally insist on seeing the man in person, verify that he was actually on the property and in a position to manage his own affairs. It was a small loophole, but it was all he needed. The sheriff had carefully planned his visit. He would bring Deputy Marcus Greenwood along, ensuring there would be an official witness to everything that happened. They would go up to the farm on a clear morning, when they couldn't be accused of arriving at an inconvenient hour, and this time he wouldn't accept excuses. Meanwhile, back at the hilltop farm, the Calder sisters continued their daily routine. They worked the land, tended the animals, and prepared meals, but there was a growing tension in the air, as if all three knew that time was running out. Margaret went up to the attic 3 times a day, carrying a tray that always returned empty. Eleanor spent more time gazing out the living room window, watching the path leading to the property. And Catherine, the youngest, began sleeping less, her eyes revealing sleepless nights. Summer was drawing to a close, bringing with it long, hot days that made the air tremble over the mountains. And somewhere inside that dark wooden house, a secret awaited discovery. The morning of July 1884 dawned with a clear sky and a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine trees. Sheriff Hackett and Deputy Greenwood saddled their horses early, knowing that the journey to the Calder farm would take much of the morning. Hackett carried with him the tax notice, his badge, and a determination that had matured over the past few years. As they hiked up the familiar trail, Greenwood remarked on the beauty of the region. The mountains stretched in every direction, covered in lush vegetation that seemed untouched by time. It was hard to imagine that anything sinister could exist amid such natural serenity, but Hackett knew those mountains well. He knew that the beauty of the landscape often concealed far darker realities. When they reached the property, they found Margaret working in the garden, as if she had been expecting them. She rose slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked unhurriedly to the fence. Her grey eyes assessed the 2 men with the same coldness as always. Hackett dismounted his horse and formally stated the reason for his visit. He needed to speak with Thomas Calder about outstanding tax matters. It was a legal requirement that could not be postponed. Margaret maintained her impeccable composure. She explained that her father was not in a condition to receive visitors at that time. His health had deteriorated considerably in recent months, and any disturbance could worsen his condition. Hackett listened patiently, but this time his response was different. He wasn't asking for permission. As a law enforcement officer, he had the right and the obligation to personally check on the well-being of a citizen who hadn't been seen publicly for several years. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Margaret glanced at the sheriff, then at the deputy, calculating her options. Eleanor had appeared on the balcony, her hands nervously clasped together. Catherine watched from a second-story window, her silhouette only partially visible through the curtains. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire property held its breath. Finally, Margaret nodded. She would take them to her father, but she imposed conditions. The visit should be brief. They could not disturb him with excessive questions, and they should respect the fragile state in which they would find him. Hackett agreed, and the 2 men followed Margaret towards the house. The interior of the residence was surprisingly organized and clean. The furniture was well maintained. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the living room table, and the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen. There was nothing there to suggest neglect or disrepair. Eleanor remained in the living room while Margaret led the visitors upstairs. The second-floor hallway was narrow and dark, lit only by a small window at the end. Margaret stopped before a door leading to the attic. She took a key from her apron pocket, unlocked the bolt, and began to climb the steep steps to the upper floor. Hackett and Greenwood exchanged a meaningful glance before following her. The attic was spacious, but the sloping ceiling meant that only the center allowed anyone to stand fully upright. Light filtered through tiny gaps between the boards covering the windows, creating golden streaks that cut through the dim light. There was a simple bed against one of the walls, a rocking chair, a small table with a lamp and some books, and sitting in the chair, wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat, was Thomas Calder. The man Hackett remembered as robust and intimidating now seemed a shadow of his former self. His face was gaunt, his beard long and disheveled, his eyes sunken and empty. He didn't react immediately to the visitor's presence, continuing to stare blankly at an undefined point ahead. Margaret approached him, touched his shoulder gently, and said there were visitors. Thomas turned his head slowly, as if the movement required great effort. The sheriff introduced himself, explained the reason for the visit, and showed the tax notice. Thomas looked at the paper without really seeing it. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Margaret quickly intervened, explaining that her father had difficulty speaking since suffering a health episode months ago. She handled all matters on his behalf, with his full approval. Greenwood discreetly walked around the attic, observing the details. There was a basin of water, folded clothes on the table, a tray with leftover food. Everything indicated that someone was being cared for there. But why in the attic? Why locked with a bolt? Why were those windows covered? Hackett tried to speak directly to Thomas. He asked if he was all right, if he needed any help, if he wanted a doctor to examine him. Thomas remained silent, his gaze wandering between the sheriff and Margaret. There was something in those eyes that deeply disturbed Hackett. It wasn't exactly fear nor confusion. It was utter resignation, as if the man had given up on something fundamental a long time ago. Margaret intervened again, suggesting that the visit had already gone on too long. Her father needed to rest, and the presence of strangers was making him restless. Hackett watched Thomas for a few more seconds, looking for any sign that the man wanted to communicate something, any indication that he was there against his will. But Thomas simply closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair as if all his energy had been drained. The two officers descended from the attic in silence. Margaret locked the door again, put away the key, and accompanied them to the exit. On the balcony, Hackett made one last attempt. He suggested that it would be appropriate to bring a doctor to examine Thomas to ensure he was receiving proper care. Margaret replied that this would not be necessary. They knew her father's needs better than any stranger, and were perfectly capable of caring for him. As they rode back to Jefferson, Greenwood voiced his impressions. Technically, there was nothing illegal about what they had witnessed. An elderly, ailing man being cared for by his daughters in his own home. There were no signs of violence, extreme deprivation, or obvious mistreatment, and yet something was profoundly wrong with the situation. Hackett agreed, but knew his hands were tied. Without a formal complaint or clear evidence of a crime, he could do nothing but document what he had seen and continue monitoring the situation. News of the visit spread quickly through Jefferson. Journalist Harrison Cole immediately sought out Hackett, eager for details. The sheriff was cautious in his words, not wanting to fuel unfounded speculation, but also unable to deny that there were disturbing aspects to the way the Calder sisters treated their father. Cole began drafting an article, carefully weighing each word to avoid direct accusations without evidence. And at the farmhouse on the hilltop, the three sisters gathered in the kitchen after the visitors had left. None of them spoke immediately. Margaret prepared tea, her movements precise and controlled as always. Eleanor gazed out the window, watching the empty path. Catherine climbed back up to the attic, carrying the dinner tray. The routine continued, relentless as the seasons, while the secret they kept remained locked behind that door. Harrison Cole's article was published in August 1884 in a Charlotte newspaper, with the discreet but intriguing title, The Guardians of the Mountains. The text described the isolated life of the Calder sisters, their dedication to caring for their ailing father, and subtly raised questions about the conditions in which Thomas lived. Cole was careful not to make direct accusations, but his words left room for readers to draw their own conclusions. The impact was immediate. Copies of the newspaper arrived in Jefferson, brought by travelers, and soon the whole village was talking about the article. Some defended the sisters, arguing that they were doing the best they could under difficult circumstances. Others questioned whether it was appropriate to keep a man locked in an attic, regardless of his health condition. The debate divided the small community, creating factions where before there had only been curiosity. Margaret stopped going to the village. Eleanor took on all the necessary shopping, enduring the curious stares and barely disguised whispers of the merchants. She kept her head down, completed her transactions quickly, and left without answering the indirect questions they posed. The pressure on the Calder family increased, but the sisters remained steadfast in their silence. In September, an unexpected event brought a new dimension to the case. A woman arrived in Jefferson from Richmond, Virginia. Her name was Abigail Morton, and she claimed to be a distant cousin of Thomas Calder. She had read Cole's article and decided to travel to North Carolina to personally check on her relative's well-being. Abigail was a middle-aged widow with her own resources and a determination that impressed even Sheriff Hackett. She sought out the sheriff as soon as she arrived, requesting his company for a visit to the farm. Hackett saw this as a legitimate opportunity to pressure the Calder sisters. If a family member was requesting access to Thomas, the daughters would have difficulty refusing without raising even greater suspicions. He agreed to accompany her, and together they climbed the trail already so familiar to the officer. Margaret greeted them with visible surprise. She hadn't expected Abigail's visit, and clearly didn't know how to handle the situation. The visitor was polite but assertive. She had traveled a great distance to see her cousin and wouldn't accept excuses about inconvenient schedules or health issues. Margaret tried to argue that her father wouldn't recognize Abigail, that it had been decades since their last meeting, and that the visit would only confuse him. Abigail remained adamant. If Thomas was truly as frail as his daughters claimed, then she had even more reason to verify that he was receiving proper care. She subtly but clearly hinted that she could legally challenge her daughter's ability to continue as his guardians if they didn't allow her access. The implied threat was serious enough to make Margaret back down. With evident reluctance, Margaret led Abigail and Hackett into the house. This time, Eleanor and Catherine were visibly nervous. They positioned themselves in the living room, watching as the group ascended the stairs. The tension was almost palpable, as if something fundamental was about to change. In the attic, they found Thomas in the same position Hackett had seen him months before. The rocking chair, the blankets, the empty stair. But Abigail noticed details that had escaped the sheriff. She observed that there was a discreet chain attached to the leg of the chair, extending to a bracket on the wall. She noticed that the windows were not only covered, but had been permanently sealed. She saw that the attic door had a bolt only on the outside, making it impossible for anyone to leave without outside help. She approached Thomas and spoke softly, mentioning memories from decades ago when they were both young. Thomas looked at her, and for a moment there seemed to be a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. He tried to speak. His lips moved with effort, but only a hoarse, incomprehensible sound came out. Margaret hurried to explain again about the speech problems, but Abigail interrupted her with a sharp look. The visitor spent the next few minutes examining the space, asking direct questions about the care routine, how much time Thomas spent there, and whether he was allowed to go out. Margaret answered with studied calm, but there were cracks in her composure. She explained that her father was safer in the attic, that he had tried to leave the house in a confused state during a previous episode, and that the precautions were necessary to protect him from himself. Abigail wasn't convinced. She questioned why a sick man needed to be kept in the attic when there were comfortable rooms downstairs. Why chained up, even discreetly? Why isolated like that? Margaret kept her answers vague, talking about specific needs, unpredictable behavior, decisions made with the father's best interests in mind. When they came down from the attic, Abigail asked to speak privately with the sheriff. In the garden, away from the house, she was direct. This was not proper care, it was confinement. There was something deeply disturbing about the situation, and she intended to take legal action if necessary. Thomas needed to be examined by an independent doctor, and his mental capacity should be assessed by competent authorities. Hackett agreed, but cautioned about the legal complexities. The daughters were Thomas's sole caregivers. There were no other close relatives involved, and up to that point, there was no clear evidence that he was being physically abused. The legal system at the time gave family members considerable authority over dependent relatives, and intervening would require more than mere suspicion. Abigail did not let herself be discouraged. She decided to remain in Jefferson, staying at the local inn while seeking legal advice. She wrote letters to lawyers in larger cities, inquired about the rights of an incapacitated man, and looked for precedents that could justify official intervention. Her presence in the village kept the case in the spotlight, preventing it from being forgotten or ignored. The Calder sisters felt the pressure mounting. They knew Abigail wouldn't give up easily, that she had resources and determination. Margaret summoned her sisters for a long conversation in the kitchen, doors closed, voices low. They needed to decide how to proceed, how to protect what they had built over those years. Autumn arrived, bringing golden leaves and a chill that foreshadowed winter. The mornings dawned shrouded in dense fog that obscured the mountains, creating an even greater sense of isolation. And while Abigail Morton worked tirelessly to find a legal way to intervene, the three sisters continued their routine atop the hill, tending the farm, feeding the animals, and climbing 3 times a day to the locked attic, where their father sat in his rocking chair, wrapped in blankets staring into space. The winter of 1884 settled over the mountains with a severity that seemed to reflect the growing tension in the village of Jefferson. Snow fell incessantly, piling up in mounds that blocked roads and isolated properties. Abigail Morton remained lodged in the boarding house, her resolve unshaken by the harsh weather. She had established correspondence with a lawyer in Raleigh, the state capital, who was showing interest in the case and researching the legal aspects of what might be considered wrongful confinement. During those frigid months, Eleanor continued making the necessary trips to the village, braving the biting cold and the even colder stares of the villagers. The community was now more clearly divided. Some saw the Calder sisters as devoted daughters doing their best under impossible circumstances. Others considered them cruel guardians who kept their father prisoner for reasons no one could fully understand. Samuel Brennan, the grocery store owner, observed Eleanor during her visits. He noticed she seemed to be aging rapidly. There was a curvature in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, a hesitation in her movements that suggested profound exhaustion. She bought the same items as always, but now she added medications to the list: pain relievers, fortifying tonics, preparations that suggested someone on the property wasn't well. When gently questioned, Eleanor would reply that they were for her father, but her tone carried an ambiguity that left room for doubt. In January 1885, an event brought new urgency to the situation. Dr. Webb, the itinerant physician who had attempted to visit the farm years before, returned to the region. This time he was accompanied by a colleague from Charlotte, a specialist in mental illness, who was conducting a study on living conditions in rural communities. Abigail Morton saw this visit as a perfect opportunity. She convinced Sheriff Hackett to arrange an official visit to the farm, this time with both doctors present, to conduct a thorough assessment of Thomas Calder's condition. The sisters' resistance was immediate and fierce. When the group arrived at the property one February morning, Margaret greeted them on the porch, refusing to let them in. She argued that her father was sleeping, that he was particularly frail at that time of year, and that the presence of strangers could cause irreparable damage to his already weakened health. Dr. Webb responded with professional patience, explaining that they were there precisely to ensure that Thomas was receiving appropriate medical care. The discussion went on for almost an hour. Margaret presented argument after argument, each excuse more elaborate than the last. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her eyes revealing a mixture of defiance and despair. Eleanor remained unseen, probably inside the house. Sheriff Hackett finally intervened, making it clear that this was no longer a request. Based on the concerns raised by a family member and the unusual circumstances of the case, he had the authority to insist on a medical evaluation. Margaret realized she was losing the battle. Her shoulders slumped slightly, an almost imperceptible sign of defeat. She made one last demand. Only one doctor could go up to the attic. The presence of many people would be too disruptive for her father. After brief consultation, the group agreed that Dr. Webb would go up accompanied only by the sheriff, while Charlotte's specialist would wait downstairs to hear his colleague's report. Margaret led the two men upstairs with slow, heavy steps, as if each step required enormous effort. She unlocked the attic door with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of genuine emotion Hackett had seen from her in all those years. When the door opened, the air that escaped the confined space carried a characteristic smell of a closed environment, of medicine, of something indefinable that made Dr. Webb frown. Thomas Calder was in his rocking chair as usual, but his appearance had visibly deteriorated since the last visit. He seemed even thinner, if that was possible, and his skin had a pallor that suggested a lack of sun exposure. Dr. Webb approached slowly, introducing himself in a soft voice and with careful movements. He began a basic examination, checking his pulse, observing his eyes, asking simple questions that Thomas did not answer. During the examination, Webb noticed details that deeply disturbed him. There were old marks on Thomas's wrists, scars that suggested earlier periods of more severe restriction. His legs showed signs of muscle atrophy, consistent with someone who spent long periods without walking. His eyes, though empty, did not show the confusion typical of advanced dementia. There was something more in that gaze, something the doctor identified as suppressed consciousness, as if Thomas were present but unable or unwilling to express himself. Margaret remained at the door throughout the examination, watching the doctor's every move with vigilant intensity. When Webb inquired about Thomas's detailed medical history, she provided vague and contradictory answers. She mentioned an episode of mental confusion that supposedly began years ago, but could not specify precise dates or clear symptoms. She spoke of aggressive behaviors that were never witnessed by anyone other than his sisters. She described escape attempts that supposedly justified the restraint measures. Dr. Webb tried a different approach. He asked Thomas directly if he wanted to leave, if he wanted to be examined in a hospital, if he needed help. Thomas looked at the doctor, then at Margaret, and remained silent. But his eyes, for just a second, held an expression that Webb recognized immediately. It was fear. Not fear of the doctor or the sheriff, but fear of his daughter watching from the doorway. When they came downstairs, Webb reported his findings to his specialist colleague. Physically, Thomas was frail but showed no signs of terminal illness. Mentally, a complete assessment was impossible under the current circumstances, but there were no clear indications of severe dementia or psychosis. The specialist asked detailed questions about the environment, living conditions, and the interaction between father and daughters. Webb's answers painted a deeply disturbing picture. In the garden, away from the house but still within the property, the group gathered to discuss next steps. Abigail Morton pressed for immediate action. She wanted Thomas removed from the house and placed under appropriate medical care. Dr. Webb agreed that the current conditions were inadequate and potentially harmful. Sheriff Hackett, however, emphasized the legal limitations. Thomas had not requested help, there was no evidence of recent physical violence, and the daughters were legally his guardians. The debate dragged on until a compromise solution was reached. Charlotte's expert would prepare an official report on the observed conditions and send it to state authorities. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hackett would increase the frequency of his visits to the property, regularly checking on Thomas's well-being. And Abigail Morton would continue to pursue legal options to challenge custody of her daughters. Margaret listened to these decisions in silence, her face an impenetrable mask. When the group finally left, she remained on the balcony watching them descend the path. Eleanor and Catherine joined her, the three sisters forming a united line against the outside world. They did not speak immediately, only watched until the visitors disappeared completely around the bend in the road. That night, lights burned late into the night in the Calder house. Shadows moved behind the curtains, silhouettes that suggested intense conversations, decisions being made. In the attic, Thomas remained seated in his chair, wrapped in blankets, gazing at the sloping ceiling where the dim light of the lamp created dancing patterns. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if hesitant to replace the harsh winter. March brought endless rains that turned the roads into rivers of mud. April offered only a few sunny days between storms, and May finally allowed the green to return to the mountains, the flowers to bloom in the fields, and life to renew its eternal cycle. During this period, Eleanor continued doing the necessary shopping, but her appearance increasingly worried the residents of Jefferson. She had lost a significant amount of weight, her eyes were constantly bloodshot, and she had developed a tremor in her hands that she couldn't completely hide. Samuel Brennan tried to talk to her a few times, discreetly offering help, but Eleanor refused any approach with a cold politeness that discouraged further contact. Sheriff Hackett kept his word, visiting the farm every 2 weeks. On each visit, he found Thomas in the same place, in the same state. Margaret always accompanied him to the attic, always provided the same explanations, always demonstrated the same superficial cooperation that concealed a fundamental resistance. Hackett meticulously documented each visit, building a record that he hoped would serve as evidence should the situation eventually reach the courts. Abigail Morton received responses from her lawyer in Raleigh. The news was not encouraging. The legal system at the time offered little protection for individuals deemed incapable, especially when under the care of immediate family members. To remove Thomas from custody of his daughters, it would be necessary to prove gross negligence or explicit abuse, something that the current evidence did not definitively support. The case was in a frustrating legal limbo, where everyone knew something was wrong, but no one had enough power to intervene decisively, and so time continued its inexorable march, each day like the last, each week merging into the next, while on the farm atop the hill, 3 sisters kept their silent vigil over the secret they had kept for so long. The summer of 1885 brought sweltering heat to the mountains of North Carolina. The air seemed to vibrate under the relentless sun, and even the shade of the pine trees offered little relief. In the village of Jefferson, residents adapted their routines to avoid the hottest hours of the day, working early in the morning and at dusk, resting during the scorching afternoons. At the Calder farm, life moved at a different pace. The sisters worked tirelessly in the heat, as if the extreme temperature didn't affect them. Margaret had further expanded the vegetable garden, cultivating varieties that required constant care. Catherine had taken full responsibility for the animals, which thrived under her meticulous attention, and Eleanor, despite her increasingly frail appearance, continued making the trips to the village, always punctual, always fulfilling her obligations. It was during one of these trips in July that Eleanor finally gave in. She was in Samuel Brennan's grocery store, paying for her purchases, when she simply collapsed. Her legs gave way, and she fell onto the store's wooden floor before anyone could catch her. Samuel rushed to help her, shouting for his wife to bring water. Other customers gathered around. Worried and surprised, Eleanor regained consciousness after a few moments, disoriented and embarrassed. She tried to get up immediately, insisting she was fine, that she had only tripped, but Samuel wouldn't allow it. He made her sit in a chair, offered her fresh water and sent for Dr. Webb, who luckily was in the village that day. Eleanor protested, saying she didn't need a doctor, that she should go home, but her voice was too weak to be convincing. When Webb arrived and examined her, his diagnosis was clear. Eleanor was severely malnourished and exhausted. She needed adequate rest, regular food, and ideally, she should remain in the village for a few days to regain her strength. Eleanor categorically refused. She needed to go home. Margaret and Catherine needed her. Her father needed her. Her agitation when talking about leaving the farm was so intense that Webb perceived something deeper there than simple family responsibility. The doctor tried a different approach. He asked Eleanor directly if she was all right, if there was anything happening on the farm she wanted to share, if she needed help beyond medical assistance. For a moment, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Her mouth opened as if she were about to speak, and everyone in the grocery store held their breath, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. But then Eleanor closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, her expression had completely closed off. She thanked the doctor for his concern, but insisted she was simply tired from the heat. Nothing more. She gathered her groceries, refused offers of help carrying them to the cart, and left before anyone could stop her again. Samuel Brennan sought out Sheriff Hackett immediately after the incident. He was convinced that Eleanor had been on the verge of revealing something important, something that would explain all the mysteries surrounding that family. Hackett agreed that the episode was significant, but questioned what he could do about it. He couldn't force Eleanor to speak if she chose to remain silent. News of Eleanor's collapse spread quickly through the village. Abigail Morton saw this as further evidence that something was deeply wrong at the Calder farm. She intensified her correspondence with the lawyer in Raleigh, arguing that there were now clear indications that the situation was negatively affecting not only Thomas, but also his own caregivers. Surely this should justify some form of intervention. In the following weeks, Margaret took over all trips to the village. Eleanor was not seen again in Jefferson all summer. The villagers speculated about her condition, some fearing she was seriously ill, others suggesting her sisters were keeping her hidden for some reason. Eleanor's absence added another layer of mystery to the already complex situation of the Calder family. Sheriff Hackett made an unscheduled visit to the farm in August, citing concern for Eleanor as justification. Margaret greeted him with her usual courtesy, but there was a tension in her demeanor that he hadn't noticed before. When he inquired about Eleanor, Margaret explained that her sister was recovering at home, resting as recommended by her doctor. She wasn't ready to receive visitors yet. Hackett asked to see her just to confirm she was all right. Margaret hesitated, and in that hesitation, the sheriff perceived a rare vulnerability. She finally agreed, but warned that Eleanor was very weak and shouldn't be disturbed for long. She led him to a room on the second floor, knocked gently on the door before opening it, and allowed Hackett to enter. Eleanor lay on a simple bed covered with white sheets despite the heat. Her face was even thinner than when he had last seen her, and there was a sickly pallor to her skin. She opened her eyes when Hackett approached, and for a moment seemed not to recognize him. Then a spark of awareness returned, and she tried a weak smile. The sheriff asked how she was feeling. Eleanor replied in a hoarse voice that she was slowly improving. Margaret remained in the doorway throughout the conversation, a watchful presence that clearly inhibited any possibility of honest communication. Hackett tried to ask more specific questions about her health, about what exactly had caused her collapse, but Eleanor only responded with generalities, always looking at Margaret before speaking. When Hackett came down again, he requested to see Thomas as well since he was there. Margaret agreed without significant resistance, as if she had realized that any refusal would be too suspicious under those circumstances. They went up to the attic, where Thomas remained in his perpetual chair, seemingly oblivious to the passing seasons, the visitors who came and went, and the drama unfolding around him. As he left the property, Hackett carried with him a growing sense of powerlessness. He was convinced that something terrible was happening in that house, but each visit revealed only ambiguities, situations that could be interpreted in multiple ways. There was no clear evidence of a crime, only an atmosphere of oppression that he couldn't document in an official report. September arrived, bringing the first relief from the intense heat. The nights began to cool, and the mornings dawned covered in a dense dew that dampened the vegetation. Eleanor was occasionally seen back in the village, still frail, but seemingly recovered enough to resume some of her responsibilities. She avoided eye contact with the villagers, hurrying to complete her tasks and return home. It was in October of that year that a seemingly minor incident brought a new perspective to the case. A boy from the village, the son of one of the local farmers, climbed up near the Calder property looking for a dog that had run away. He didn't actually reach the house, but he passed close enough to hear sounds that intrigued him. He told his parents that he had heard what seemed to be someone rhythmically tapping against wood, a repetitive sound coming from somewhere inside the house. The parents initially dismissed the story as childish imagination, but the boy insisted on what he had heard. The story eventually reached Abigail Morton, who saw in it another piece of the disturbing puzzle. She questioned whether those sounds could be Thomas trying to communicate something, trying to get attention, signaling in some way that he needed help. Sheriff Hackett listened to the story with interest, but knew that the testimony of a child who had briefly passed near the property hardly constituted sufficient evidence for legal action. Still, he documented the incident, adding it to the growing file on the Calder family that he kept in his office. As autumn progressed and the leaves began to fall, covering the mountain floor with a golden and red carpet, the feeling that something had to give way grew stronger. It was as if the entire village was waiting for a defining event, something that would finally clarify the mysteries surrounding that house on the hilltop. But that moment had not yet arrived, and in the meantime, the Calder sisters continued their isolated existence, guarding their secrets with unwavering determination. The winter of 1885-1886 settled over the mountains with an unsettling stillness. The snow fell in heavy, silent flakes, accumulating slowly but steadily, transforming the landscape into a uniform white world where the boundaries between sky and earth seemed to dissolve. The village of Jefferson reduced its activities to the bare minimum, and families retreated to their homes, waiting for spring to bring renewal. Abigail Morton had decided to remain in the area indefinitely. She rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Jefferson, establishing a more permanent residence than the boarding house where she had initially stayed. Her determination to resolve Thomas Calder's situation had not diminished over the months. On the contrary, each new piece of information, each small incident, only reinforced her conviction that her cousin was being kept in inadequate conditions and that something needed to be done. During those cold months, Abigail devoted herself to studying North Carolina laws related to guardianship and the rights of incapacitated individuals. She filled her cabin with borrowed law books, correspondence with lawyers, and official documents she had requested from various government agencies. Her desk was constantly covered with papers, notes, and drafts of petitions she hoped to eventually present to the appropriate authorities. The lawyer in Raleigh with whom he corresponded regularly had begun to explore a different approach. If they couldn't directly challenge the custody of their daughters based solely on inadequate care, perhaps they could argue that Thomas Calder had never been legally declared incompetent. Without such a declaration, technically, he still retained his civil rights, including the right to receive visitors, to consult doctors of his choice, and to manage his own finances. The daughters, by restricting him without formal legal authorization, might be violating those rights. It was a technical distinction, but it could open doors that had previously remained closed. Abigail began working with the lawyer to draft a formal petition to be submitted to county authorities, requesting a legal assessment of Thomas's capacity and the legitimacy of the restrictions imposed by his daughters. The process would be slow and complicated, but it was the best option available within the limits of the legal system at the time. Meanwhile, at the Calder farm, winter brought subtle but significant changes. Eleanor had physically recovered from the collapse of the previous summer, but something within her seemed to have broken. She moved through the house like a shadow, performing her tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without any trace of the vitality that, though always contained, had once animated her movements. On the rare occasions when she was seen in the village, her gaze was empty, as if she were only physically present, while her mind dwelt somewhere distant and inaccessible. Catherine, on the other hand, displayed a restless energy that contrasted with her sister's apathy. She had taken on more responsibilities on the farm, expanding the henhouse, repairing structures damaged by the winter, and planning improvements for the following spring. There was an almost fierce determination in her constant activity, as if she were trying to prove something to herself or to the outside world. Margaret remained the gravitational center around which the other two orbited. Her visits to the village were even less frequent, and when she did come down to Jefferson's, she completed her transactions with an efficiency that discouraged any attempt at conversation. Samuel Brennan noticed that she always paid for her purchases with old coins, some of them minted decades ago, as if the family were using long-accumulated savings rather than generating new income. Sheriff Hackett maintained his regular visits throughout the winter, always finding the same scene in the attic. Thomas sat in his chair, wrapped in blankets, staring blankly into space. Margaret explained that their father was stable, neither better nor worse. The sisters superficially cooperated with the inspections, while maintaining an invisible but impenetrable barrier around their true thoughts and motivations. In February 1886, an unexpected event brought new urgency to the case. The local church reverend, a man named Arthur Whitmore, approached Sheriff Hackett with a specific concern. Eleanor had begun attending Sunday services with increasing regularity, always sitting in the same pew at the back, always leaving immediately after the final blessing. But recently she had stayed after a service and asked to confess something to the reverend. Whitmore explained that he was bound by the seal of confession and could not reveal the specific content of what Eleanor had told him. However, he could say that the conversation had left him deeply disturbed. He wasn't sure if what Eleanor had described constituted something that should be reported to the authorities, but he felt morally obligated to at least alert the sheriff that there were aspects of the situation at the Calder farm that were even more complex and problematic than anyone had imagined. The Reverend's vague statement frustrated Hackett, but he understood the ethical constraints that bound the clergyman. He asked if Eleanor had shown any intention of harming herself or others, if she had mentioned any specific crime, if she appeared to be in immediate danger. Whitmore answered negatively to all these questions, but reiterated that the confession had left him with a weight on his conscience that he could not easily dismiss. Hackett decided to make an unscheduled visit to the farm soon after his conversation with the Reverend. He walked up the familiar trail on a frosty February afternoon, finding the property covered in snow that reflected the weak winter sunlight. Margaret greeted him with visible surprise, and he noticed her hands trembling slightly as she opened the door. It was the first time he had seen her display such obvious nervousness. He explained that he was simply checking to see if everything was all right after the Reverend's concerned comments about Eleanor. Margaret immediately became defensive, asking what specifically the Reverend had said. Hackett was careful not to reveal details that could compromise the trust between Eleanor and the clergyman, only mentioning that there were general concerns about Eleanor's emotional well-being. Margaret replied that her sister was going through a difficult time, that the isolation of winter and the constant responsibilities of caring for their father were taking their emotional toll. But Eleanor was fine, she assured her, and there was no reason for alarm. Hackett asked to see her, and Margaret, after a brief hesitation, agreed. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing bread when Hackett entered. She glanced up briefly at the sight of him, but immediately returned her attention to the dough she was kneading. Hackett approached slowly, commenting on the pleasant aroma of the fresh bread. Eleanor murmured an almost inaudible thank you. He then asked directly if she was all right, if there was anything she would like to share with him, if she needed any kind of help. Eleanor stopped kneading the dough, her hands motionless on the floured surface. For a long moment, she remained completely still, and Hackett could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers dug into the soft dough. Margaret, who had followed the sheriff into the kitchen, watched intently from the doorway, her presence clearly inhibiting any possibility of honest conversation. Finally, Eleanor resumed working with the dough and said in a monotone voice that she was fine, just tired, as her sister had explained. Nothing more. Hackett tried a few more questions but received only monosyllabic answers that revealed nothing. He realized he wouldn't be able to break Eleanor's silence while Margaret was present, but he also had no legal grounds to ask her to speak to Eleanor privately. Before leaving, Hackett conducted his usual check on Thomas in the attic. This time, he spent more time observing the man, searching for signs of non-verbal communication, any indication that Thomas was aware of what was happening around him and wished to convey something. But Thomas remained in his usual state of absent presence, his eyes wandering across the empty space, without focusing on anything specific. March brought the first signs that winter was losing its grip. The snow began to melt in patchy shards, revealing the brown, damp earth beneath. Streams that had been frozen began to flow again, their steady murmur filling the silent valleys. And with the thaw came a sense that greater changes were coming, that the stalemate that had characterized the Calder family's situation for so many years was about to break. Abigail Morton finally received news from her lawyer in Raleigh. He had drafted a formal petition to be filed with the county court, requesting a hearing on Thomas Calder's situation. The petition argued that, in the absence of a legal declaration of incapacity, Thomas retained his civil rights, and that the restrictions imposed by his daughters needed to be evaluated by a judicial authority. It was no guarantee of victory, but it was the first formal step in a legal process that could eventually force changes. News of the petition spread through the village even before it was officially filed. Jefferson was too young to keep secrets for long, and soon everyone was talking about the impending hearing, speculating about what might be revealed, wondering how the Calder sisters would respond to this direct legal challenge. At the farm, the sisters received official notification of the petition in April 1886. A court officer came up to the property and delivered the documents to Margaret, explaining that she and her sisters would be expected in court on the specified date to respond to the allegations presented. Margaret accepted the papers without visible emotion, thanked the officer politely, and closed the door as soon as he left. That night, the three sisters gathered in the kitchen after dinner. They spread the legal documents out on the table, reading each word carefully, discussing in hushed voices what it meant for them, for their father, for everything they had built up over those years of isolation. The conversation stretched late into the night, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls as they debated their options. Margaret argued for continuing their strategy of superficial cooperation but fundamental resistance. They would attend the hearing, answer questions, and maintain consistent stories. Catherine suggested a more aggressive approach, questioning Abigail Morton's right to interfere in family matters, challenging the legal legitimacy of her petition. Eleanor, the quietest of the three, simply listened, her hands clasped in her lap, her face revealing an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Spring had arrived, bringing with it nature's usual renewal. Wildflowers covered the fields, birds returned from their winter migrations, and the air filled with the sense of growth and transformation. But at Calder Farm, the atmosphere remained heavy, laden with the tension of secrets kept for too long, of truths pressing against the barriers that contained them, threatening to finally break through to the surface. The hearing date was set for June of that year, giving both sides ample time to prepare their arguments. Abigail Morton worked tirelessly with her lawyer, gathering testimonies, documenting all visits and observations made over the years, building the strongest possible case within the legal limitations of the time. Sheriff Hackett provided his detailed records, and Dr. Webb prepared a medical report on the conditions in which he found Thomas during his assessments, and as June approached, the entire village of Jefferson waited with growing anticipation. The hearing promised to finally shed light on the mysteries that had surrounded the Calder family for so long. Answers would be demanded, truths would be revealed, and the fate of Thomas Calder would be decided no longer by the daughters who kept him isolated, but by a legal system that, though imperfect, offered at least the possibility of justice. The morning of the hearing dawned with a clear, bright sky, as if nature itself wished to witness the outcome of that story that had kept the village of Jefferson in suspense for so many years. The small courthouse of Ashe County had never seen so many people gathered. The pews were completely full, and many residents remained standing at the back of the room, eager to witness the moment when the secrets of the Calder family would finally be revealed. The three sisters arrived together dressed in their finest clothes, but maintaining the sobriety that characterized them. Margaret walked ahead, her posture erect and her face a mask of serene determination. Eleanor followed with hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the curious gaze of the crowd. Catherine brought up the rear of the trio, her chin raised in a gesture that mixed defiance and pride. They sat on the designated bench without looking at anyone, waiting for the procedure to begin. Abigail Morton sat across the room next to her lawyer. She watched her sisters with an expression that mixed determination and something close to compassion. Despite everything, she sought no revenge or punishment, only to ensure that her cousin received the proper care and dignity that every human being deserved. The judge entered, and the room fell into absolute silence. What followed were hours of testimony, legal arguments, presentation of evidence, and counter-arguments. Sheriff Hackett described his multiple visits to the farm, the conditions in which he had found Thomas, and his growing concerns over the years. Dr. Webb presented his medical assessment, explaining that although Thomas was frail, he had found no evidence of terminal illness or severe dementia that would justify the level of restriction imposed. Margaret spoke in defense of herself and her sisters with surprising eloquence. She described the challenges of caring for an increasingly confused and unpredictable father, the difficult decisions they had been forced to make to ensure their safety, and the emotional and physical burden of bearing this responsibility alone without outside help. Her voice did not waver once, and many in the room found themselves almost convinced by the apparent sincerity of her words. But then Eleanor was called to testify. She walked slowly to the witness stand, her hands visibly trembling. When Abigail's lawyer began asking questions, Eleanor initially responded with the same vague explanations she had offered for years. But something in the atmosphere of that room, in the presence of so many people, in the seriousness of the moment, began to break down the barriers she had built around her truths. Her answers grew increasingly hesitant. She began to contradict minor details of Margaret's narrative. Long pauses settled between questions and answers, and tears began to silently stream down her face. The lawyer, sensing that something was about to break, asked the crucial question, "Eleanor, do you keep your father in the attic because he is ill, or is there another reason?" The silence that followed was so profound that everyone in the room could hear their own heart beating. Eleanor looked at Margaret, then at Catherine, and finally at her own hands clasped in her lap. And then, in a voice so low that the judge had to ask her to repeat it louder, she began to speak. What Eleanor revealed that day completely changed everyone's understanding of the situation. There was no illness that justified the confinement. There was no violence from the father that needed to be contained. What existed was something much more complex and dark, rooted in years of distorted family dynamics, old resentments, and decisions that started small but grew into a prison for everyone involved, including the sisters themselves. The hearing dragged on for hours as details slowly emerged, each revelation adding a new dimension to a story no one had fully grasped. When it finally ended, the judge announced that he would need time to consider all the information presented before making a decision. In the weeks that followed, Thomas Calder was temporarily removed from the farm and placed under supervised medical care while awaiting a final decision. The sisters remained on the property, but now under regular observation by the authorities. The village of Jefferson, which had speculated for so long about the mysteries of that family, finally had answers, though not the simple answers many had hoped for. What happened to Thomas and his daughters after that summer of 1886 became part of the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Some people chose to see the sisters as cruel villains. Others saw them as victims of impossible circumstances, who made terrible choices with intentions they believed to be justified. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere in between, too complex for simplistic judgments. The house on the hilltop remained for many years after those events, gradually deteriorating with the passage of time. Travelers passing through the region would sometimes stop to look at the abandoned structure, wondering what secrets those walls had held, reflecting on how isolation and silence can transform a family into something unrecognizable. We will never fully know what goes on in the hearts of those who make decisions in the dark, far from the eyes of the world. The story of the Calder sisters reminds us that real mysteries rarely have clean resolutions, that the truth is often stranger and sadder than any fiction could invent, and perhaps that's what makes these stories so fascinating and frightening at the same time. They show us that the darkest secrets aren't always hidden in obvious places, but sometimes live in ordinary houses, in families that seem normal from the outside, protected by the complicit silence of the mountains and the distance that isolation provides. If you've made it this far on this journey through the shadows of Appalachia, leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story. Subscribe to the channel for more narratives that explore the darkest corners of history, and don't forget to turn on notifications. Until the next journey.